Good morning, everyone. In last video, we talked about the definition and the features of the Cold War. And also last class, I mentioned if we need to answer the question how cold was the Cold War, we need to use all those definitions and also features to evaluate those events in the Cold War to see to what extent that the Cold War was cold, right? We're going to learn the first real conflicts between the two blocs. That is the Berlin Crisis. Despite all the threatening talk of the early years of the Cold War, the two sides had never actually fired on one another. But in 1948, they came dangerously close to war. So Berlin blockade actually was the first real test for the American policy of containment. We're going to see how the US they contained the USSR in the Berlin crisis. When we talk about all the wartime conferences, we know about the arrangement for the Germany, right? After the Second World War, Germany was divided into 4 zones, and also Berlin itself was also divided into 4 zones. So while all these zones were assigned to different countries, this is a time when they start to have conflicts. This is a time when people they try to discuss about the arrangement for Germany after their occupation. Because at that time, after the destruction of the Second World War, Germany was in economic chaos. So their policies and their intention actually can lead to very different results for the development for Germany as a country, right? So they have different ideas on how to deal with these German problems. While some of them think just break them down because at the old times the reason why we started the Second World War is because they grew too strong, right? And they just keep expanding to other countries. While on the other side, some others think we should help them to become self-sufficient. Because like here in the cartoon, if we don't let him work, who's going to keep him, right? That means if we are not let them to become self-sufficient, that means we have the responsibility since they are under our occupation. That means we have the responsibility to help them. That means we need to provide them with economic aid, right? So some of them will think help them a little at the beginning and let them become self-sufficient actually is like a better way to deal with them. So who do you think have the idea to break them down while the other side try to help them to become self-sufficient? Very obvious, right? It was the West, the Western countries who wanted to speed up the economic recovery of Germany, which had been devastated by war and was now facing serious shortage of food and fuel. On the other side, the Soviet Union actually wanted the quite opposite to secure itself from a future attack. It wanted to keep Germany weak and refused to allow its own zone to trade with the other 3 zones. So you can see on one side, the Western countries try to help Germany to become self-sufficient. Firstly, at that time, Germany, they could not feed its people if it was not allowed to rebuild its industry. They always think that this is like a more of a long-term policy, right? To let them become self-sufficient, to let them help themselves. More importantly, in order to let different zones have collaboration with each other to encourage this kind of economic recovery, British, France, and USA, they combined their zones in 1946 to form one zone. Of course, the reaction of Stalin is like a huge suspicious of their decision when they try to form together. They become like really strong, right? And also more importantly, the Marshall Plan, the economic rivalries, right? So in 1948, with the support of allies, with the Marshall Aid, and within months, were signs that Germany was recovering. Of course, only for the western part of Germany, right? And you have to know, in addition, these countries, they set up free elections to establish democracy in this part of Germany. So on the other side, you can see like total different story. While Stalin tried to break Germany down, a part of reason is because during the wartime conferences, actually, they don't really have an official reparation. They don't really have an exact amount of money as reparation for USSR, even though they have to bear the largest casualties, right? So the only way they can get the reparation is from all these occupation zones, right? So they think they're doing something reasonable since they sacrificed a lot of people in the Second World War. So they think since these Western countries, the capitalists, they are treating the Western Germany so well, it has become like an action of provocative. It's like you are showing others that we are so bad, right? And since you are so good, to help them to become self-sufficient, right? So you can, when the actions and the policies took by the Western countries were in sharp contrast with the Soviet policies, Stalin feared a strong, democratic, and reunited Germany since they formed together as one zone on the borders of Soviet Union. He feared that the Western currency and the democratic ideas would spread to the Soviet zone, to their part of Germany, to the East Germany, right? And undermine the control of East Berlin. Maybe like further have impacts to Berlin since Berlin was deep inside the Soviet zone, right? So he think that I can't do anything to your zone, but since Berlin was deep inside the Soviet zone and was linked to the western zone of Germany by vital roads, railways, and canals, because I have all those western zones inside my Soviet zone, right? Just like the picture here, since these western zones were in the Soviet zone, of course, he think that he has a chance to make use of this, right? So he chose to stamp his authority on Berlin by block all roads, railways, and canal supply lines, cutting off the 2 million strong population of the West Berlin from the West help. So what was Stalin expecting from this kind of action? He think by doing this, actually what he can gain is to force the Allies out of Berlin and make Berlin entirely dependent on USSR. That means he wants 100% Soviet zone, not a Soviet zone that has some place occupied by other countries, right? So for now, for Truman, actually he have, I think, 3 options. First option is, of course, gave in, right? To just let Stalin to have Berlin, right? Secondly, is to denounce them by sending aircraft, right? To provide supply to those zones, because with airlifting, it won't break the blockage of Stalin, it won't violate them of their blockage, but at the same time can give supply to the western zones. Thirdly, to start a direct conflict by using tanks, right? Of course, after Truman Doctrine, Truman won't give up on any of the zones that is under the attack of Soviet Union, as what he mentioned in the Truman Doctrine, right? So for him, maybe just 2 choices now. Use tanks or use planes. What do you think Stalin was expecting? If US tanks did try to ram the roadblocks or railway blocks, Stalin would see it as an act of war, right? You can let like anyone come and see US tanks, they are triggering a war to let the US become the aggressive one, to let them to have a bad reputation. But on the other side, when they send these aircrafts and also send those planes, the airlifting into the Berlin Western Zone, Stalin can't shoot them down. Why? Because they don't want to be the one who trigger the war. If they shoot their aircraft down, they are the one who take actions to trigger the war, right? So, and also more importantly, for US, they still have the they still dominate the military power in the world at that time because they were the only country who have nukes, who have the nuclear bombs, right? So of course, for Stalin, he's testing Truman's bottom line, right? So as a part of containment policy, of course, Truman will choose to use the aircraft, right? So the plane actually got through, and for the next 10 months, West Berlin was supplied by the constant stream of airplanes bringing in everything from food and clothing, oil, and even building materials. And for the test of Stalin, it's obvious that the result is the Allies, they won't give up Berlin, right? And also, more importantly, as a warning to the Soviet Union, Truman ordered bombers capable of carrying atomic bombs to be sent to Britain. Now, the Soviet Union was within US bombing range. That means they can send a nuke to Berlin or to the Soviet Union anytime if they want to freely destroy a city, right? This is the reason why Stalin found himself have no other choice but to give in, right? So Stalin reopened the communication by May 1949. So this marked the end of the Berlin crisis. But you have to remember all the impacts of Berlin crisis. It's obvious that Germany was now clearly divided. Within a few days of the end of the Berlin crisis, just in May 1949, the Western Allies, they announced that their former occupation zones, including West Berlin, would join together to form the Federal Republic of Germany. So Stalin's response was rapid, and the same year, in October 1949, the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, which under the sphere of influence of Soviet Union. And also very important is the formation of NATO in April 1949. This is an alliance of countries around the North Atlantic for their mutual defense. You may see how this kind of NATO alliance became the part of containment policy. Like while all these countries are joining NATO, it's like they're containing the expansion of Soviet Union in Europe, right? So what does it mean by mutual defense? Mutual defense means if any member state was attacked, other members should provide it with military support, just like the alliance we mentioned during the First World War. So of course, Stalin will take reaction with this, respond to the formation of NATO with the Warsaw Pact in May 1955, actually already like 6 years after that. Similarly, an alliance of the communist countries of Eastern Europe from their mutual defense. So this kind of alliance and organization all involve military support. I think for Berlin crisis, the saddest thing for Stalin is the time when they have to give in when the US start to threaten them with the nuclear bomb, right? So it's a time when Stalin made up his mind to build their own atomic bomb, and they successfully built it in August 1949. Finally, they exploded the first atomic bomb. The US no longer have the monopoly on the nuclear weapons. Just like here. So this is actually the settlement for the MAD, mutual assured destruction. While all these countries, they have atomic bombs behind them, and they will just use all these primitive bow and arrow to attack each other, right? So they just use this atomic bomb to shock each other, to prevent further expansion. But they won't use them for the mutual assured destruction. They only use like these different ways, like the cold way, right, to attack each other. So from here, how Berlin crisis can help you to answer this question, how cold was Cold War? Because Berlin crisis has happened like in the early age of the Cold War. You have to see the importance of it is this incident actually helped to demonstrate what the Cold War actually consists of. It set out a pattern, a basic pattern for Cold War confrontation. On one hand, the two superpowers and the allies have shown how suspicious they were of each other. They take every action seriously, right? And how they would obstruct each other in almost any way they could, right? How they would bombard each other with propaganda instead of atomic bombs, right? And on the other hand, each had shown that it was not willing to go to war. So even though US sent the bomber and keep the Soviet Union into their atomic bomber range, still they won't send the atomic bomb to cause a huge destruction of the USSR to avoid any revenge, right? So the Berlin blockade established a sort of tense balance between the superpowers. Actually, you can use all these keywords in red to describe the cold part of the Cold War, and use Berlin crisis as a very important example to show the cold part, the cold feature, while the tense balance between the superpowers and how they keep attack each other with propaganda and different things instead of go to a real hot war. Okay, so next class we're going to talk about the spread of communism in Asia and talk about the Chinese Civil War and Korean War. See you in next video.